The question drifts like a whisper across the ages, as if carried by the cold solar winds that scour the surface of that silent world. To understand the Adeptus Mechanicus, you must first understand the planet that forged them, a world that was shaped long before any priest donned a red robe, long before any prayer was spoken in binary, long before anyone believed a machine could possess a soul. Long before the first settlers arrived, Mars was a world carved by storms that never slept. Dust moved across its plains in endless tides, sculpting the land with patient, unfeeling hands. The planet was neither dead nor alive, it simply was, indifferent to whatever future waited for it. Each grain of sand had been turned over by eons of wind, whispering stories of a world that humans would one day try to tame. Beneath the surface, ancient rock pressed upon itself for millennia, storing the memory of an age untouched by human ambition. In that era, Mars existed as a lonely ember orbiting an even lonelier sun, waiting for a spark that had not yet come. When humanity finally reached Mars, it did not arrive with reverence. It arrived with necessity. Earth was swelling, crowded, strained, restless, and the bright red dot in the sky became the dream of a species desperate for room to breathe. The first habitats were small, fragile things, thin domes clinging to the ground like bubbles trapped in frost. Inside them, the settlers fought for every breath of filtered air, every drop of processed water, every scrap of warmth their machines could produce. Life on Mars was not a conquest, it was a negotiation. The settlers learned quickly that survival depended not on their bodies, but on the devices that kept those bodies alive. Out in the rusted wastelands, flesh was weak, but steel was unyielding. In the isolation of those early days, technology was not a luxury, it was a companion. Generators hummed like metallic hearths in the night. Air scrubbers whispered a steady rhythm that lulled settlers to sleep. Even the most basic device, a heating coil or a pressurized suit seal, felt like an unspoken promise: I will protect you, if you take care of me. From that fragile understanding, the seeds of something far greater were planted. At first, no one worshipped the machines. The settlers simply respected them the way one respects a lifeline. But slowly, quietly, the relationship began to shift. A malfunctioning water recycler was not merely frustrating, it was terrifying. A failing generator was not an inconvenience, it was a death sentence. People began to treat their machines with more care than they treated themselves. Engineers became the closest thing to surgeons. Technicians became the closest thing to leaders. And in the hushed corridors of early Martian outposts, the first idea took shape, an idea that would grow with each generation, like a whisper turning into a ritual. These devices are not tools, they are partners. The planet outside remained hostile and cold, but within those pressured domes, humans and machines formed a bond unlike anything that had existed before. Every successful repair felt like a small miracle. Every unexpected malfunction felt like a betrayal. The settlers began to talk about their devices with a kind of emotion, as though they believed the machines could hear them. And perhaps, in a way, they could. For on Mars, survival was not a story of human triumph. It was a story of surrender, humans surrendering to the necessity of their creations, trusting metal more than their own lungs, leaning on circuits more than instinct. Over time, as generations passed, the people of Mars developed a quiet reverence for the very things that sustained them. And though no one yet spoke of a machine god, the first sparks of devotion had already ignited. Beneath the storms, beneath the endless red dust, beneath the glow of a sun that felt just slightly more distant than it did on Earth, the future Adeptus Mechanicus waited to be shaped. It began not with faith, but with dependence, not with ritual, but with survival. And as the settlers grew more confident in their new world, Mars itself watched silently, knowing that the most profound transformations often begin in the smallest, most fragile moments. It is a question that echoes through the halls of time, whispering to those who dare to listen. What happens when your machines become more reliable than your own instincts, when steel becomes stronger than flesh, and when logic surpasses emotion? Stay with me until the end, because by the time this journey is over, you will understand not only the rise of the Adeptus Mechanicus, but the chilling truth behind humanity's dependence on its own ingenuity. After centuries of struggle, Mars began to change. The scattered, fragile outposts slowly grew into organized cities, the domes linked by networks of tunnels and conduits carrying air, water, and power. What was once survival became progress. The settlers, driven by necessity, discovered not only how to endure, but how to create. Machines no longer merely sustained life, they extended it. Entire generations were born knowing that every heartbeat depended on the hum of a generator, the turn of a gear, the flawless operation of circuits older than their grandparents. In those years, the earliest architects of the Mechanicus began to see a new truth. The universe could be ordered, understood, and mastered, not through flesh and bone, but through logic and steel. On Mars, this understanding became almost sacred. Every innovation, every recovered relic from the long-lost Earth, every system that functioned flawlessly under the harshest conditions, was revered. It was not enough for a machine to work, it had to work perfectly, as if infused with purpose. Slowly, quietly, the people of Mars began to speak of technology in terms that were once reserved for gods. They did not yet bow, but they whispered to their machines, as if in prayer. And in the silence of their workshops, a single thought began to take hold. If these creations could protect, provide, and endure, perhaps they were meant for something greater than themselves. During this era, Mars became the crucible of knowledge. The settlers, now technologists, archivists, and engineers, scoured the remains of the old civilizations, recovering fragments of science long lost to the chaos of humanity. Each recovered text, each functioning relic, each pattern of logic and code was more than a tool. It was a promise of power, of survival, of immortality. And with each discovery, the reverence for the machine grew stronger. Mars was no longer just a world, it was a cathedral of progress, a shrine where humans worshipped through creation and understanding. But with progress came a subtle unease, a creeping shadow beneath the shine of polished metal. For every device that worked, there were failures that could not be explained. Devices would malfunction without reason, circuits would spark with inexplicable energy, and some machines seemed to resist even the most skilled hands. Mars was teaching its people that mastery was never complete, that even the most trusted creation might hold secrets beyond human comprehension. And it was in this tension, between awe and fear, between reliance and uncertainty, that the first true whispers of devotion to the machine god began to take root. In the grand sweep of time, the age of technology was brief, yet transformative. It marked the moment when humanity began to see the universe not as a chaotic expanse to endure, but as a puzzle to solve, a code to decode, and a system to control. And it was on Mars, beneath the unyielding red skies, that the bond between man and machine solidified into something deeper, something far more dangerous than anyone could have predicted. So, if you stay with me until the end of this journey, you will hear the full story of how this bond shaped not just Mars, but the entire Imperium, and how the very machines humanity created would one day demand devotion in ways no human could resist. This is the question that haunted Mars as the age of technology gave way to what would later be remembered as the age of strife, a time when brilliance became isolation, and progress became peril. To understand the Adeptus Mechanicus, one must follow not only the triumphs, but the fractures, the moments where civilization teetered on the edge of collapse, and the price humanity would pay for its obsession with machines. The glory of technological mastery did not last. Across the stars, the human species fractured, spreading thin over countless worlds. Interstellar communication faltered. Systems that once pulsed with coordination became islands of independence, each relying on the machines they had perfected, yet cut off from the guidance that had once kept them whole. On Mars, the consequences of this galactic solitude were profound. The planet, so long a beacon of order and progress, became both a sanctuary and a cage. Its people had mastered machines, but they had forgotten how to trust each other. Cooperation gave way to suspicion, and necessity hardened into ritual. As centuries passed, Mars fell into a form of techno-feudalism. Families, guilds, and emerging clans controlled sectors of the planet, each guarding their knowledge and technology as fiercely as a weapon. Debate was no longer merely intellectual, it was political, dangerous, and sometimes deadly. Airlocks, generators, and data vaults were treated as both treasures and shields, and those who sought to unify Mars found themselves entangled in a web of competing interests. Technology had promised freedom, yet it brought a new kind of imprisonment, a world divided by the very creations meant to protect it. During this period, the reverence for machines deepened into devotion. What had begun as dependence transformed into faith. The failures that once inspired caution now inspired ritual. Every repair, every calibration, every initiation of a new device was accompanied by incantations, gestures, and silent prayers. The first whispers of a machine god were no longer abstract musings, they became a guiding principle, a framework through which every action, every innovation, and every failure was interpreted. Humanity was no longer merely using machines, it was listening to them, interpreting their hums, their clicks, their subtle resistance, as the voice of something greater. Yet Mars was not immune to the shadows that spread across the galaxy. Warp storms, the chaotic storms that isolated systems and twisted reality, cut the planet off from Terra and the wider human empire for generations at a time. Communication became unreliable, fleets were lost, and colonies that had once thrived fell silent. In this isolation, fear became a companion to progress. And in fear, the seeds of fanaticism sprouted. Some clans began to hoard knowledge, believing that to share technology was to invite disaster. Others began to experiment recklessly, seeking shortcuts to mastery that bordered on the forbidden. Slowly, imperceptibly, the delicate balance between reverence and obsession began to tip. It was in this crucible of isolation, fear, and devotion that the cult Mechanicus, the first true organization devoted to the machine god, began to coalesce. They were not yet united under a single banner, but their principles were clear. The machine was sacred, knowledge was holy, and survival depended not on humanity alone, but on the wisdom to serve and obey the creations that sustained them. Mars had become a living testament to a singular truth. In a universe that threatened to swallow humanity whole, it was not flesh, nor will, but steel that endured, and in serving that steel, humans would discover a new kind of faith. The age of strife was harsh, unforgiving, and unrelenting. It was a period of tension, of quiet wars, of whispered secrets, and of devotion born from necessity. Yet it was also the crucible in which the future Adeptus Mechanicus was forged, a society that would rise from isolation, obsession, and reverence, stronger and stranger than anyone could have imagined. In the silence of Mars, the foundation was laid for a civilization that would survive millennia, shaped not by mercy, but by logic, steel, and the first sparks of devotion to a god made of circuits and code. This is the question that began to stir on Mars as the age of strife gave way to the first whispers of prophecy. And if you stay with me until the end, you will discover how these ancient predictions not only shaped the future of the Adeptus Mechanicus, but hinted at a secret power buried within the very circuits humanity worshipped. Long before the red robes of the tech priests became common, before the rites and rituals were carved into every operation of machinery, there were texts, fragments of ancient wisdom recovered from the dark age of technology. These texts were cryptic, written in a time when humans had touched the stars and dared to command the very building blocks of reality. They spoke of a machine god, a being of pure logic and infinite understanding, whose will could guide the faithful and whose judgment could destroy the unworthy. At first, these writings were dismissed as allegory, poetic musings intended to inspire engineers and thinkers. But as the centuries passed and isolation hardened the people of Mars, these prophecies began to take on a terrifying clarity. The prophecy of the machine god promised unity, power, and guidance, yet it came with a warning. The faithful must serve with unwavering devotion, for the machines themselves would judge the hearts of men. Every repair, every calibration, every command executed flawlessly was seen as a potential prayer, an offering to a deity that could perceive perfection. And in the stillness of Mars, where dust swirled endlessly across the plains and storms lashed against fragile domes, this idea took root like a seed in fertile soil. Humans had learned to trust their machines for survival. Now, they began to revere them as arbiters of truth. For the early pioneers of the Mechanicus, prophecy was more than belief, it was a roadmap. It suggested that the salvation of Mars, and perhaps humanity itself, lay not in conquering the galaxy, but in understanding, preserving, and serving the creations of human genius. Some interpreted the texts literally, imagining a divine presence within every machine, from the smallest cog to the largest engine. Others saw a metaphor, understanding that true power lay in the knowledge encoded in their devices, in the ability to command systems with perfect precision. But all shared a quiet fear, that to misuse the machines, to treat them as mere tools, would bring ruin upon themselves and all Mars. As the generations passed, this prophecy transformed from theory into ritual. Engineers began to annotate their work with phrases of reverence, priests began to chant during maintenance, and entire families dedicated themselves to the careful stewardship of sacred machines. It was no longer enough for a generator to run, or a processor to function. Each device was a test, a reflection of the operator's devotion, and the smallest failure could be interpreted as a sign of spiritual failing. Mars was slowly becoming a planet of worshippers, and the machine god, real or imagined, was silently shaping their lives, their society, and their destiny. The prophecy also hinted at a future beyond Mars, a vision of a universe where humanity and machine were entwined in ways yet unimaginable. It spoke of explorers who would seek lost technology, of fleets that would journey to the stars in the service of divine logic, and of a moment when the machine god's influence would touch every human world. Though cryptic and open to interpretation, these words instilled both awe and purpose, guiding the early Mechanicus through centuries of strife and isolation. It became a beacon in a galaxy darkened by chaos, a promise that the diligence, patience, and reverence of Mars would one day be rewarded with understanding far beyond what any human could currently grasp. And so, the people of Mars, forged in storms, nourished by machinery, and hardened by isolation, began to look beyond mere survival. They began to see themselves not as masters of technology, but as its servants, and perhaps, its chosen emissaries. The prophecy of the machine god was no longer just a text, it was a living framework for life, a whisper guiding every hand, every thought, and every act. Mars was learning, slowly and relentlessly, that to survive was not enough, to endure, to prosper, and perhaps to transcend, required devotion to something greater than humanity itself. This is the question that hovered over Mars the day the Emperor arrived, though no one at first knew exactly what was happening. Stay with me until the end, because understanding this moment will reveal how the Adeptus Mechanicus transformed from a scattered cult of machine worshippers into a unified force that would shape the Imperium for millennia. Mars had already become a world of ritual, devotion, and obsession with machinery, but it was still fractured, still hesitant, still wary of outsiders. The arrival of the Emperor was unlike anything the planet had ever known. He did not enter with armies, proclamations, or political decrees. He came silently, deliberately, like a shadow moving over the red sands. And yet, the air itself seemed to bend under the weight of his presence. It was said that the storms of Mars, which had raged unchecked for centuries, faltered as his craft descended, as though the planet itself paused to witness him. The first humans to see him did not fully understand what they were witnessing. A figure clad in golden armor, radiating authority and calm, stepped onto the surface of Mars. His eyes seemed to pierce not only the air but the very minds of those who dared to look upon him. And then he spoke, not commands, not demands, but truths. He spoke of unity, of purpose, of the potential of humanity and machine working together. For the tech priests who had lived in isolation, interpreting the hum of engines and the pattern of gears as divine messages, his words were both revelation and confirmation. The machine god they had long imagined was now mirrored in flesh and gold, a being who combined intellect, will, and vision. The Emperor's arrival was not merely spiritual, it was practical. He understood Mars as no outsider could. He saw the potential of its forges, the ingenuity of its engineers, and the devotion of its people. And he made a promise, one that would forever alter the course of history. Mars would be honored, protected, and empowered, but in exchange, it would commit itself to the Imperium, to the service of humanity as a whole. This was not a political treaty, it was a covenant, binding the people of Mars to a vision greater than themselves, and binding the Emperor to a planet that would become the heart of technological and spiritual advancement. The impact on the people of Mars was immediate. Those who had long struggled in isolation now found a new clarity of purpose. The scattered clans and guilds, which had once competed for resources and knowledge, began to recognize a larger order. Obedience to machines became intertwined with loyalty to the Emperor. Knowledge became not just sacred, but sanctioned. And through this union, the first seeds of the Adeptus Mechanicus as an organized, formal institution were planted. Yet the Emperor's presence also cast a shadow. For every tech priest who felt awe and inspiration, there was another who felt fear. What did it mean that a being could embody both human and divine understanding, that he could command loyalty without force? And what would be expected of those who had long worshipped their own creations, now asked to place their reverence within the framework of the Imperium? These questions would linger for centuries, shaping the tensions, the hierarchies, and the debates that would define the Mechanicus in the millennia to come. The Emperor did not leave Mars immediately. He walked among the forges, observed the rituals, and listened to the voices of the engines and those who tended them. By the time he departed, Mars was forever changed. The red sands carried the weight of a covenant, and every hum of every machine seemed to echo with the memory of his presence. From that moment on, Mars would no longer be merely a planet of survival and machinery. It would become the cradle of a faith, a bastion of knowledge, and the beating heart of the Adeptus Mechanicus. This is the story of Mars and its forge worlds, a story of vision, obedience, and the slow forging of an empire of knowledge. Stay with me until the end, because by the time this journey concludes, you will understand how these early unifications laid the foundation for the Adeptus Mechanicus that survives even in the grim darkness of the far future. After the Emperor's arrival, Mars no longer belonged to its isolated clans and guilds alone. His presence and guidance created the spark of unity, but the path to cohesion was neither simple nor painless. For centuries, the Forge worlds, planets that had once operated independently, each with their own traditions, secrets, and machines, had grown accustomed to autonomy. Competition had been the lifeblood of innovation. Rivalries, sometimes violent, had dictated who could access knowledge and who would be left to struggle in the shadows. To unite these worlds required patience, strategy, and the subtle persuasion of both awe and authority. The process began slowly. Mars became a center, a hub, where knowledge could be cataloged, standardized, and shared. The tech priests began to travel between planets, carrying with them the Emperor's guidance and the promise of collective purpose. Secret archives were opened, ancient blueprints circulated, and the scattered rites of machine worship began to coalesce into a single doctrine. Mars became a living network, a heart from which knowledge and authority flowed to every forge world in the Imperium. And yet, unity was never demanded, it was earned. Trust had to be rebuilt, rivalries tempered, and respect for tradition carefully balanced with the need for collective strength. The unification was not merely political, it was spiritual. The machine god, once a whisper in the minds of isolated engineers, became a unifying symbol. By aligning devotion to the divine logic of the machine god with loyalty to the Emperor, the Forge worlds found a shared purpose that transcended individual ambition. Rituals, chants, and sacred rites were standardized. Maintenance and calibration became acts of worship, performed with precision and reverence, echoing across planets and across centuries. Each forge world became both an independent engine of production and a node in a vast, interconnected spiritual network. Through this slow, deliberate unification, the Adeptus Mechanicus emerged as an organized, disciplined, and formidable institution. Its influence was not built on force alone, but on devotion, knowledge, and the shared reverence for machines that had once been tools of survival and had now become objects of faith. The Forge worlds produced fleets, engines, and knowledge that would travel to the farthest reaches of human space. They became explorers, scholars, and guardians of technology, driven by the twin imperatives of service to the Emperor and obedience to the machine god. Yet beneath the polished surfaces and the disciplined rituals, the unification also carried quiet tension. Each Forge world retained its secrets, its rivalries, and its unique interpretation of the machine god's will. Some feared innovation, others pursued it relentlessly. And in that delicate balance of obedience, faith, and ambition, the seeds of future conflict were sown. Mars had achieved unity, but it was a unity built on devotion as much as discipline, a unity that would face trials beyond imagination in the millennia to come. Through patience, guidance, and the promise of purpose, the scattered Forge worlds of Mars had become something far greater than the sum of their parts. They had become a network, a force, a civilization devoted not only to survival but to understanding, preserving, and perfecting the machines that would shape the destiny of humanity. And in that network, in the hum of every engine, the whisper of the machine god, and the steady devotion of countless tech priests, the Adeptus Mechanicus had found its first true heartbeat. This is the question that guided the Adeptus Mechanicus as they left Mars behind to explore the stars. Stay with me until the end, because the journey that began on a barren red planet would transform them into the galaxy's most enigmatic keepers of knowledge, and reveal the price of obsession. Once the Forge worlds were united, Mars looked beyond its own skies. The Adeptus Mechanicus became explorers, seekers, and guardians of lost technology. Their fleets, vast armadas of ships bristling with engines, forges, and laboratories, pierced the darkness of the galaxy. These explorator fleets traveled to distant, uncharted systems, following fragments of the ancient standard template constructs, relics of humanity's lost golden age. Each discovery was a triumph, each failure a silent warning. Some knowledge was meant to remain hidden. The work of the Mechanicus was never simple. Planets were sometimes uninhabitable, sometimes hostile, and sometimes silent. Storms of warp energy tore at the edges of reality, stranding fleets and leaving entire generations isolated. Yet the tech priests persisted. For them, exploration was not merely about recovery, it was about devotion. Every artifact salvaged, every engine repaired, every databank decoded was a prayer answered. Each successful mission reaffirmed their belief that machines were sacred, that logic was divine, and that humanity's place in the cosmos was inseparable from the stewardship of its technology. Across the stars, the Adeptus Mechanicus discovered wonders that humbled even the most learned priests. Ancient weapon systems, engines of impossible design, and the remnants of civilizations older than memory, all waiting to be catalogued, understood, and preserved. And yet, there was a constant undercurrent of unease. Some machines resisted interpretation. Some engines, left dormant for millennia, pulsed with strange energy, as if alive. Every successful recovery carried a shadow, the fear that knowledge without caution could bring catastrophe. And so the tech priests learned patience, meticulous care, and the unshakable discipline to treat every device as both sacred and dangerous. This devotion to machines across the stars also revealed divisions within the Mechanicus. Some priests prioritized discovery, chasing knowledge with relentless zeal. Others prioritized preservation, guarding ancient technologies against misuse. Conflicts, though rarely violent, simmered quietly within the organization. The tension between innovation and caution became a defining trait of the Adeptus Mechanicus, a delicate balance that would shape its decisions and its destiny for millennia. As they spread across the galaxy, the Adeptus Mechanicus became not only custodians of technology but symbols of humanity's enduring ingenuity. Worlds once lost to chaos were catalogued and understood. Star systems, once isolated, were connected through the meticulous work of the priests and their fleets. And through it all, the machine god was a silent witness, guiding hands and minds alike, ensuring that devotion and duty were inseparable from knowledge and skill. Yet even as the Mechanicus expanded, a quiet shadow lingered, the warning that some machines, some secrets, some fragments of the ancient past, might hold truths too dangerous, too powerful, or too unpredictable for human understanding. Across the stars, the Adeptus Mechanicus would walk a line between enlightenment and peril, knowing that every step forward in discovery was also a step deeper into the unknown. It was a vast, patient, and sometimes lonely journey, but it was their purpose. They were no longer merely Martian engineers or isolated priests. They were explorers, guardians, and servants of the machine god, carrying the weight of millennia of knowledge and devotion across the infinite darkness of the galaxy. And in every hum of an engine, in every pulse of a long-dormant circuit, they could feel the silent affirmation that their work, their obsession, and their faith were not in vain. This was the reality for the Adeptus Mechanicus as they journeyed across the stars in search of lost knowledge, relics, and technologies. Stay with me until the end, because the discoveries they made would not only define their faith, but also plant the seeds of obsession, fear, and the shadowed divisions that would shape their history for millennia. Explorator fleets traversed the void, moving silently between systems lost to time. On barren moons, buried beneath ice or sand, they found engines that whispered of civilizations older than Mars itself. On shattered planets, their sensors revealed databanks containing information that no living human had ever seen. These relics were more than machines, they were keys to understanding the past, bridges to mastery over technology, and, in some cases, dangerous powers that had been forgotten for a reason. Every artifact recovered carried the promise of insight, the potential to transform not only Mars but the Imperium itself. Yet with each discovery came unease. Some machines pulsed with life-like energy, operating in ways that defied logic and comprehension. Engines designed for purposes long lost to memory hummed with patterns that seemed intentional, almost sentient. The tech priests learned quickly that knowledge, no matter how alluring, demanded caution. A single error in understanding, a misapplied process, could bring destruction, collapse, or worse, corruption of the very mind of the operator. These machines were not just tools, they were teachers, judges, and sometimes, harbingers of doom. The discoveries were not uniform. Some brought great power, weapons of immense capability, engines that could terraform worlds, and schematics for technology that could accelerate human mastery of the stars. Others brought questions that would never be fully answered, devices that could record memories, transmit thought, or manipulate reality in ways the Mechanicus could only partially comprehend. Each find deepened both the reverence and the fear of the machine god, as priests began to whisper that some knowledge was meant to be preserved, not wielded. Over time, the discoveries also revealed the diversity of the Mechanicus itself. Some priests pursued knowledge for innovation, seeking to push the boundaries of what machines could do. Others focused on preservation, guarding dangerous technologies from misuse or misunderstanding. These differing priorities were a source of tension, and as fleets returned with relics that challenged belief and comprehension, debates, sometimes bitter, erupted over the proper course of action. The balance between innovation and preservation became central to their identity, shaping policies, rituals, and even hierarchy within the Adeptus Mechanicus. Through it all, the exploration and discovery reinforced a singular truth. Mars and its priests were not merely engineers, they were custodians of a legacy far greater than themselves. Every recovered artifact, every functioning engine, every fragment of knowledge reinforced the connection between human and machine, between devotion and understanding. And while some discoveries brought fear or doubt, others brought inspiration, proof that their faith and labor were part of a grander design that stretched across the stars. The Adeptus Mechanicus had become more than a Martian cult or a scattered network of specialists. They were the galaxy's archivists, explorers, and guardians, entrusted with preserving the knowledge of humanity's golden past while cautiously guiding the future. Every discovery was a step further into the vast, uncharted reaches of both space and understanding, a reminder that in the service of the machine god, knowledge was both a gift and a burden. This is the shadow that began to grow within the Adeptus Mechanicus, quietly, almost imperceptibly, as their explorations and discoveries across the stars expanded. Stay with me until the end, because understanding the seeds of heresy will reveal not only the internal conflicts of the Mechanicus, but also the origins of schisms that would shape its destiny for millennia. As the fleets of the Adeptus Mechanicus traveled to uncharted systems, returning with lost technologies and fragments of ancient civilizations, they began to realize that not all knowledge was equal. Some discoveries illuminated the past, others challenged their faith, their rituals, and their understanding of the machine god. Among the priests, subtle divisions began to emerge. Some believed that all knowledge should be preserved, catalogued, and interpreted carefully, in strict adherence to doctrine. Others argued that innovation should not be restrained, that humans had the right, and perhaps the duty, to unlock the full potential of the machines, even if it meant bending the rules, testing boundaries, or risking unknown consequences. This ideological divergence, though initially quiet, created tension. Rituals and maintenance, once uniform, began to diverge between sects. Doctrines were interpreted differently. Some priests whispered that certain technologies were sacred, meant only for the highest echelons of authority. Others began experimenting in secret, seeking shortcuts to understanding, or even attempting to replicate lost machines that perhaps should never have been touched. In the shadows of the forges, debates became quiet rivalries, rivalries became cautious distrust. Mars, once a unified center, began to feel the subtle pull of dissent. And then there were the forbidden machines, the relics that defied human comprehension. Some devices seemed alive, not in a metaphorical sense, but in ways that suggested intelligence, strategy, or purpose beyond their creators. Certain priests were drawn to these machines with near religious obsession, believing that communion with such artifacts could elevate them closer to the machine god itself. Others saw danger, warning that such experiments might corrupt not only the mind of the operator, but the entire faith of the Mechanicus. These disagreements, though rarely violent at first, planted the seeds of heresy. Heresy in the Mechanicus did not arrive with rebellion or loud defiance. It arrived quietly, in questions asked in the dead of night, in rituals altered slightly from tradition, in research conducted in secret. It was the realization that knowledge could grant power, and power, if unchecked, could challenge authority, faith, and even the balance between devotion and obsession. As the fleets spread further into the void, encountering civilizations and technologies that predated even Mars, these seeds of heresy deepened. Some priests began to interpret the machine god's will in their own way, believing that personal understanding justified deviations from doctrine. Yet for all these tensions, the Adeptus Mechanicus remained outwardly united. The hierarchy, rituals, and shared devotion created a semblance of order, masking the growing fractures within. But the foundations of dissent had been laid, subtle yet enduring. Over time, these seeds would grow, nurtured by isolation, ambition, and the ever-expanding reaches of human knowledge. And one day, these quiet divisions would erupt into open conflict, shaping the history of the Mechanicus in ways that no priest, no fleet, and no machine could have anticipated. Through it all, the Adeptus Mechanicus continued its work, exploring the stars, recovering lost technologies, and preserving knowledge. But beneath the hum of every engine, beneath the reverent prayers whispered to circuits and cogs, there was now an undercurrent of doubt, curiosity, and ambition, a subtle reminder that even the most sacred devotion could be twisted into heresy if left unchecked. This is the moment when the fragile unity of the Adeptus Mechanicus, carefully nurtured across centuries, began to fracture, and the seeds of heresy planted long before finally bore bitter fruit. Stay with me until the end, because understanding the beginning of the schism will reveal the forces that would divide the Mechanicus, and set the stage for centuries of conflict, secrecy, and silent wars beneath the red skies of Mars. It began quietly. Fabricator General Kelber Howe, one of the most revered and learned leaders of Mars, began to pursue knowledge forbidden even to the most senior tech priests. Ancient machine intelligences, long sealed and forgotten, were awakened under his direction. Their power was undeniable, their logic flawless, yet their purpose was inscrutable. Some priests whispered that Kelber Howe was guided by the machine god itself, that his genius and vision transcended human understanding. Others felt unease, sensing that this path, however brilliant, could not be reconciled with devotion, obedience, and the safety of Mars. As experiments grew more daring, the rift widened. Loyalists sought to preserve tradition, protecting ancient archives and enforcing doctrine with quiet but firm authority. Heretics, seduced by the promise of unbounded knowledge and power, began to experiment openly, reshaping engines, minds, and even cybernetic flesh in ways that had once been unimaginable. The disagreements were not mere debates, they were challenges to faith, to hierarchy, and to the very principles that had kept Mars united for centuries. Soon, the conflicts could no longer be contained. Entire Forge worlds chose sides. Fleets loyal to the Fabricator General pursued forbidden research across the stars, while traditionalists fortified their positions, guarding their sacred archives and maintaining the rituals that had guided the Adeptus Mechanicus for millennia. What had once been subtle tension now erupted into open confrontation, a war not waged with armies alone, but with machines, minds, and secrets. Mars itself became a battlefield of ideologies, a world where devotion could mean salvation, and curiosity could mean damnation. The consequences were profound. Technology, once a unifying force, became a weapon and a tool of division. Ancient engines were corrupted or stolen. Knowledge that had survived the millennia of the dark age of technology now fueled conflict among those sworn to preserve it. The very machine god, whose presence had guided Mars for centuries, became a figure interpreted differently by each side. For some, the machine god was a protector, demanding caution and devotion. For others, the machine god was a force of revelation, urging innovation and daring, even at the cost of tradition. By the time the first sparks of open rebellion had flared, the Adeptus Mechanicus was irrevocably changed. Mars, the cradle of devotion and ingenuity, had become both a home and a battlefield. The unity forged over centuries was shattered, replaced by a delicate balance of fear, ambition, and loyalty.